I still remember standing there on that cold Sunday afternoon, the last of the mourners drifting away from the cemetery, the scent of damp earth still clinging to my clothes. My husband had been gone for barely a week, and my heart felt raw, like a wound that hadn't even begun to close. I thought, at the very least, I would have the comfort of family. But instead, I felt the sharp sting of betrayal from the very people I trusted most. My son, Daniel, barely looked me in the eye. His wife, Melissa, moved quickly and efficiently, almost as if I were just another detail to be handled and dismissed. And when she told me without hesitation that it might be best if I didn't stay in the house anymore, it was as though the ground opened beneath me. My own daughter-in-law, speaking those words with such cold certainty, while my son stood silently by her side. It cut deeper than the grief I was already carrying. I tried to convince myself I had misheard, that maybe she didn't mean it that way. But the truth was written on her face, in the way she ushered me aside, making space for her own parents while I stood there clutching the hand of my grandson. That little boy looked up at me with such innocent eyes, still too young to understand what was happening. He was the only one who held on to me, as if sensing that I no longer belonged in the world his mother was trying to build. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle, quiet, but unmistakable. A door closing, a seat at the table quietly taken away, a whispered decision made behind my back, and it was happening at the very moment when I needed love the most, when the loss of my husband had left me more fragile than I had ever been. I stood in the living room that evening, surrounded by family photos on the wall, realizing that I was being erased from the picture slowly, deliberately. My son's silence hurt more than any words. Why would he let this happen? Why would Melissa want me gone so quickly? Was I truly such a burden? Or was there something else hidden beneath her polished smile? That was the beginning of a truth I never expected to uncover. Before everything unraveled, my life had been a tapestry woven with simple joys and hard-earned sacrifices. I spent more than 30 years teaching at the local elementary school, guiding children through their first books, their first essays, their first fears of standing in front of a class. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was never much, but it gave me purpose. I used to tell myself that every child I encouraged was an investment in the future. When Daniel was born, he became the center of that future for me. My husband and I poured everything we had into him: our time, our savings, our dreams. We skipped vacations, bought secondhand furniture, and counted every dollar carefully so we could afford his education. I still remember walking past a department store window one winter, wishing I could buy a new coat, but instead, tucking the money aside for Daniel's school supplies. Little choices like that were how we built his opportunities. My husband, Richard, was my anchor in all of it. He was steady, practical, and kind. When I grew weary, he reminded me why it mattered. When I doubted myself, he held me up. Our home was modest, but full of laughter, especially on Friday nights when Richard would cook his famous chili and Daniel would sit at the table telling us about his day. Those are the memories that glow in my heart, the kind of warmth you think will last forever. But time changes everything. Richard passed away far too soon, leaving me with an emptiness I still can't quite put into words. Losing him felt like losing half of myself, and I leaned on Daniel more than I ever admitted. Watching him grow into a man, seeing him marry, and holding my grandson for the first time, it gave me hope that life still had beauty, even in the midst of loss. I tried to be the kind of mother and grandmother who was always there. I babysat when they needed a night out, cooked dinners when they were overwhelmed, and slipped small amounts of money into their account when I knew bills were piling up. It never felt like charity. It felt like love. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Melissa began to keep me at a distance, and Daniel's calls grew less frequent. At first, I blamed busy schedules, the natural rhythm of young families finding their own way. But there were subtle signs, little comments, financial decisions made without me, changes in the household dynamic that hinted at something deeper. I couldn't name it then, but I felt it pressing against me like a shadow, waiting to reveal itself. That quiet unease was the thread that would eventually unravel everything. The first betrayal didn't come like a thunderclap. It slipped in quietly, like a draft through a cracked window, chilling me before I even realized what was happening. A few weeks after Richard's funeral, Melissa invited her parents and siblings over for dinner. I thought it might be a chance for all of us to share a meal, to feel like a family again, even if only for one evening. I arrived early, carrying a casserole dish my late husband's favorite recipe, one Daniel always asked me to make when he was younger. But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the shift. The living room was buzzing with conversation, Melissa's family filling every corner, their voices loud and cheerful. I stood there for a moment, waiting for someone to notice me. Daniel gave me a brief smile, distracted, as though I were just another guest. My own son, who once lit up whenever I walked into a room, now barely acknowledged me. I set the casserole on the counter, only to watch Melissa slide it aside to make room for her mother's dish. No words of thanks, not even a nod. Just the quiet scraping of glass on countertop, pushing my contribution out of the spotlight. I told myself not to read into it, but the silence weighed on me. As dinner began, I realized there was no seat set aside for me at the table. I lingered awkwardly, until finally Melissa's brother offered me his chair. She brushed it off, saying there hadn't been enough space and I could make myself comfortable in the living room. I sat alone on the edge of the couch with a small plate, balancing it on my lap, while laughter rose from the dining room. Through the doorway, I could see Daniel at the head of the table, chatting easily with his in-laws. His face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. My grandson wandered over to sit with me, his little hands reaching for my food, his innocent presence a balm against the sting. But even then, Melissa called him back sharply, insisting he stay at the table with the family. The words hit me harder than I expected. The family. As if I were something separate, no longer part of the circle I had helped build with my own sacrifices. I kept my smile fixed, nodding politely when someone glanced my way. But inside, my heart was unraveling. I thought of all the nights I stayed up grading papers just to save for Daniel's future. All the years Richard and I went without, so our son could have more. To be treated like an afterthought, pushed to the margins of my own son's home, felt like a betrayal so deep I couldn't put it into words. I left that night with my casserole dish untouched, the weight of it heavier than when I arrived. Something was wrong, very wrong. And deep down, I sensed this wasn't just about manners or oversight. There was a current beneath Melissa's polished smile, a quiet calculation I couldn't yet see. That was the night I began to wonder what else had already been taken from me without my knowledge. It started with something small, just a line on a bank statement. I had gone online to pay a utility bill when I noticed a withdrawal that didn't make sense. A few $100s gone, marked as a transfer I couldn't remember authorizing. I told myself maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had clicked something by mistake. At my age, It's easy to doubt your own memory. But then another charge appeared, and another. Each one chipped at my peace of mind, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. One evening, I pulled out every statement from the past year and spread them across my kitchen table. I sat there with a pen in hand, tracing circles around the numbers that didn't add up. The deeper I went, the more the circles multiplied. This wasn't forgetfulness, it was a pattern. Transfers into accounts I didn't recognize, payments for credit cards I never opened, and the strangest of all, a small insurance payout, processed under my name, though I was very much alive. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. Someone had been dipping into my savings, siphoning funds bit by bit, hoping I would never notice. It felt like an invasion, as though someone had broken into my home, rifled through my drawers, and stolen not just my money, but my sense of safety. And the cruelest thought of all was that the culprit had to be close. Who else would have access to my accounts? Who else knew enough about me to pull this off? I remembered Melissa's sharp eyes, the way she always insisted on handling paperwork after Daniel's death, brushing me aside with practiced ease. I thought of Daniel's silence at that dinner table, the way he avoided my gaze. A cold realization began to settle over me. This wasn't just carelessness or disrespect, this was calculated. Someone had decided I was expendable, and my savings were theirs for the taking. The betrayal cut deeper than words can express. All those years of sacrifice, every penny Richard and I tucked away for security in our old age, for Daniel's stability, for the family's future, it was being drained behind my back. I felt sick, a physical nausea that left me gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, disbelief held me frozen. Maybe the bank made an error. Maybe I was wrong. But as I held those papers in my hand, the evidence staring back at me in black and white, I knew I wasn't mistaken. My trust had been broken, and my family, the very people I loved most, were at the center of it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake in the dark, the documents spread before me, my heart pounding with equal parts rage and fear. I had been erased from the table, dismissed like I no longer mattered. Now I saw the reason it was easier to steal from someone you pretended no longer existed. By morning, my grief had hardened into something sharper. If they thought I was too old, too weak, or too broken to fight back, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I knew I couldn't rush into this blindly. If I confronted them without proof, they would deny everything, twist the story, and leave me looking like a confused old woman. So I started small. Each morning, before the sun rose, I spread my papers across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. I kept a notebook by my side, carefully copying down dates, amounts, and account numbers. It was tedious, but with every page, the picture grew clearer. At first, I was terrified of making a mistake. I second-guessed myself constantly, afraid I'd misread a number or forgotten a payment. But the deeper I went, the less room there was for doubt. These weren't accidents, this was deliberate, systematic. Whoever was behind it knew exactly what they were doing. I drove to the bank one morning, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, and asked to speak with a representative I trusted. I didn't tell her everything, only that I was worried about unusual activity. She pulled up the records, her eyes narrowing as she flipped through the screen. She lowered her voice when she explained that several new accounts had been opened under my name, ones I had never authorized. Her tone was polite, but I could see the concern in her expression. Walking out of that bank, I felt a chill despite the warm air. I was being watched in ways I had never imagined. I realized I had to move carefully. So I made copies of every document, kept them in a folder hidden beneath the floorboard of my bedroom closet. I even began carrying a small notebook in my purse, writing down every detail in case something happened to me. There were nights when fear nearly swallowed me whole. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Melissa or Daniel would notice my digging. What if they confronted me before I was ready? But then I remembered the years I had spent holding classrooms together, managing dozens of children with nothing but patience and persistence. I wasn't helpless. I had built resilience my entire life. And so, step by step, I built my case. Each discovery gave me strength, even as it broke my heart. I knew this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about dignity, about being seen and valued rather than discarded. By the time I placed the last document into that hidden folder, I was no longer trembling. The fear was still there. Yes, but it was woven with something stronger. A quiet resolve. I was ready. The day would come soon when I would have to look my son in the eye and ask him the question burning inside me. How could you do this to your own mother? The day I decided to confront them, I felt an odd calm settle over me. My heart was pounding. Yes, but there was also a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I had stacked my folder of documents neatly on the coffee table, each page marked and highlighted, the evidence impossible to ignore. When Daniel and Melissa walked into my living room that evening, I could see the surprise on their faces. They hadn't expected me to call them over. They certainly hadn't expected me to look so composed. I let the silence stretch, long enough to make them shift uncomfortably. Then I slid the folder across the table. My voice was steady when I told them I had been going through my finances. At first, they tried to feign confusion. Melissa even reached for a sympathetic smile, as though I were a fragile old woman misinterpreting numbers. But as I opened page after page, the color drained from Daniel's face. The first betrayal was bad enough: unauthorized withdrawals, transfers into accounts I had never approved. But the deeper I went, the darker it became. There were credit cards opened in my name, debts piling up I hadn't created. And then came the final blow: an attempted claim on a life insurance policy, one that required a death certificate forged in my name. I paused to steady myself as I laid that document on the table. Seeing my own name on a fraudulent certificate sent a chill through me. I looked at Daniel, my son, and waited for him to speak. His lips parted, but no words came. Melissa sat stiff, her hands clenched in her lap. In that moment, the air was thick with betrayal. My grief for Richard, my years of sacrifice, my love for my family, it all collided with the brutal truth that the very people I trusted most had tried to erase me, not only from their lives, but from existence itself. I told them I had copies of everything, tucked safely away. I told them the bank knew. I told them that if they thought I would crumble quietly, they had underestimated me. My voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The weight of my words hung heavier than any shouting ever could. The twist, the one that twisted the knife deeper, was realizing just how long this had been in motion. The forged documents weren't new. The accounts had been opened months earlier, maybe longer. This wasn't desperation, it was premeditated. And my son, the boy I raised with every ounce of love I had been a willing part of it. I ended the confrontation not with rage, but with resolve. I told them they had one chance to make things right, or the next conversation would not be with me, it would be with the authorities. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel looked down at his hands. Melissa's face hardened, and for the first time, I realized just how far this betrayal truly reached. I didn't know what they would choose, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer afraid to fight. In the days after that confrontation, the silence in my home felt heavier than ever. But it was no longer the silence of fear, it was the silence of decision. I had given them their chance, and to my surprise, Daniel called me first. His voice was uneven, stripped of the arrogance I had heard before. He admitted that what I found was true. There were no excuses left, no stories left to twist. Melissa, on the other hand, was furious. She sent messages trying to paint me as cruel, trying to make me feel guilty for even threatening to expose them. But guilt no longer had a hold on me. I had lived too many years putting others ahead of myself. This time, I stood firm. With my lawyer's help, restitution was arranged. Money began to trickle back into my account, slow at first, but enough to prove that they knew I wasn't bluffing. The forged accounts were closed, the fraudulent cards canceled, and the life insurance claim flagged with the proper authorities. Every step was exhausting, but every step was also a reminder that I still had power, that I wasn't the frail woman they imagined I would be. The price, however, was steep. My relationship with Daniel fractured, maybe beyond repair. When I looked at him now, I didn't see the little boy I once tucked into bed. I saw a man who had chosen lies over love, greed over trust. That truth stung more deeply than anything money could buy. And yet, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. I wasn't erased. I wasn't invisible. And I wasn't broken. I had pulled back the curtain and shown them exactly who I still was: a mother, a grandmother, a woman who refused to be written out of her own life. The resolution wasn't perfect. The scars remain, and I don't know if forgiveness will ever take root. But justice, in its own way, was served, and for the first time in months, I felt the ground steady beneath me. What lingered most was not anger, but a question: how could family, the very people meant to protect you, betray you so completely? That question would haunt me, but it would also lead me to a deeper lesson I never expected to learn. Looking back now, I can see how close I came to letting grief and betrayal define the rest of my life. For a time, I believed I was powerless, that the world had shifted without me, and there was no place left for my voice. But I was wrong. What happened to me proved something I had nearly forgotten: that strength doesn't disappear with age, and dignity doesn't vanish just because others fail to see it. The pain of being betrayed by family will never fully fade. It is a wound that still aches when I think of Daniel, of the choices he made, and of how Melissa looked at me as if I were nothing more than an obstacle. But from that pain came a hard truth I needed to face: respect in a family must flow both ways. Love cannot survive if it is rooted in lies, and trust cannot grow if it is treated like something disposable. I've learned to hold boundaries, to protect myself, even from the people I once believed incapable of hurting me. That isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And in reclaiming my place, I've discovered a peace that is stronger than the chaos they tried to bury me under. My days are quieter now, but they are mine. I wake up knowing I have weathered storms and come out standing. I no longer fear being erased, because I carry within me the proof that I fought for my truth and held it firmly in my hands. If my story speaks to you, if you've ever felt overlooked or betrayed, know this: you are not alone, and you are not powerless. Share this story, leave your thoughts, and tell me where you are listening from. Your voice matters, too.